Welcome to the InnovAiT podcast with myself, Dr. Hussain Gandis. We're going to be introducing our chair of the RCGP, Professor Martin Marshall, and we're going to be asking him questions about basically what life is like as the chair of the college and answering your questions live on this live stream. And if you're catching us on the podcast, hope you're enjoying it. Let's get going, shall we? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this live stream as we are joined by our chair of the college, Professor Martin Marshall. How are we doing there, Martin?
I'm good, thanks, Candy. It's good to see you. Thanks for inviting me on.
Thank you for joining us. And I appreciate it's really challenging to get to do these kind of things at this time because, as everybody knows, it's chaos and just really busy in general practice. So thank you for joining us and for the opportunity for our trainees to ask you questions as well. So we've had quite a lot of questions that have come through from trainees. And if there aren't anybody joining us live on the stream, feel free to ask us questions so that we can ask those to Martin as well. I'll come to the live questions a bit later on, but we have had a fair few that have come through, particularly from the trying to get an understanding of the trainee voice. And if it's okay, I'd love to launch into those. But before we do, can you just tell us what else you do apart from being obviously the chair of the college?
Yeah, so I might be the original version of the portfolio career. So I've always been a GP. I've been a GP for about 32, 33 years. Started off as a partner in Devon and then became an academic, and my clinical practice has been as a salaried GP, first of all in Moss Side in Manchester and now in East London. So my job now is I do between half a day and a day a week of clinical practice in Newham. I'm pretty much the rest of my time, the whole of the rest of my time is as chair of the college. It's pretty much a full-time job, but I am also an academic at UCL, Professor of Healthcare Improvement at UCL, but for the last couple of years I've not really done very much in that space.
And how do you find juggling the variety of hats with obviously general practice, the college, the academic stuff and things? How are you finding that?
Well, I've always enjoyed it. I've always been the kind of person that likes to have variety in their life. I like portfolio career. I get a buzz, I get energy from the interaction between one element of my life and another element of my life. So I find it fine. There was one stage of my life, just as I was leaving my practice in Exeter in the late 90s, when I had 5 different employers. And that was pretty complicated, I have to say. But most of the time I like variety, so it's good.
Absolutely. And I guess with that, obviously during your chairship of the, being chair or chairship, I don't know if that's a proper word or not, of the college itself, you've had to deal with possibly one of the most career defining things that have happened in healthcare, which is COVID. I mean, how has that experience been for you?
Well, it has been. It's been an interesting experience, I think it's fair to say. My predecessor, Helen Stokes Lampard, just before I started 2 years ago, sent me a good luck card, which is typically generous of her. And in that good luck card, she said, in fact, I've actually got it here. There you go. It's got an owl on the front. I'm emblem of the college. There you go. And inside the card, it says, "May you have no crises." Little did she know that I was going to have two of probably the biggest crises that general practice has faced. Of course, the pandemic, a global crisis, a crisis for the nation, a crisis for the NHS, and a crisis for general practice, but also the crisis which has been brewing for years, but has come to a head in my chairship, which is the workload crisis in general practice. So 2 crises. It's been tough. I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about leadership. I'm quite sure I've made mistakes. I hope I've done some good stuff as well. Having a good team around me in the college, a great team of officers, a great leadership team, our executive team as well, has been really important. The pandemic is a pandemic. I mean, I guess, this is probably the first major pandemic that I've ever worked through, but at least, with a pandemic, there's going to be an end to it eventually. And let's hope we're kind of getting into that space now. The workload crisis in general practice, to me, feels like a much more worrying one. The answers to the workload crisis, although we've got them, are much more difficult to implement.
Okay. And we are going to answer some more questions about current general practice and stuff. But I thought before we got to that, I think what would be useful for particularly the AITs, and a couple of questions we do get about from the AITs in particular, it is, what exactly does the chair do? So could you talk us through what a typical day would be as chair? I don't know if there is such a thing, but
Yeah, no, there isn't a typical day, and I guess that's what makes it interesting to me. But my role as chair is essentially to act as the public voice and the public face of the college and of general practice. So that's public to our membership, of course. Public to the people that we're trying to influence, particularly policymakers, politicians, other organisational bodies that we work with, and public to the media and through the media to other stakeholders as well. So, my job, I spend my time clearly listening to and speaking to members, visiting their practices, visiting different locations around the country where I can learn something about general practice, what's going on the ground. I spend a lot of my time in meetings with policymakers, a range of different meetings, including meeting politicians like Secretary of State and our Minister for Primary Care, but a range of other stakeholders as well, whether it be leaders of NICE or CQC, NHS England, of course, regularly, so a range of different other stakeholders. I give quite a lot of lectures and seminars. I do quite a lot of mentoring of people and support work with people, and support our CPD work as well. So there's a range of different kind of activities that keep me busy and certainly provide an awful lot of variety. That's for sure.
Okay, and you mentioned obviously the interface that you've had with a variety of organisations. You mentioned NHS England, the Health Secretary, all this kind of things. Which have you found the most challenging?
They're all challenging in their own ways. I think probably politicians, and that isn't because they aren't bright, and it isn't because they're not committed. They're often very bright and very committed. And once you kind of understand politics and the nature of political ambition, it becomes kind of easier to work with them. But my frustration with politicians is that they take general practice for granted. They kind of half know that general practice is important, but their focus has always historically been on the hospital sector, because hospitals cost a lot more than we do, but 9 or 10 times more than we do. So they soak up a lot of the budget, and they're higher profile in the public and media's mind. So when something goes wrong in a hospital, politicians are called to account far more rapidly than if they're called to account when they're struggling in general practice. So my biggest frustration and challenge, I guess, has been finding the narrative, finding the language, finding the ways of engaging them with why general practice is so important to patients, to communities, and to the NHS as a whole, and why they need to give it more attention. That means more policy attention, a stronger focus, and it means more resources as well. And that's been the biggest challenge.
Okay, and how have you seen that impact change over the past couple of years and stuff? Because obviously COVID was just game changing for general practice and obviously variety of services and things. But how have you seen that interface change compared to, I guess, what you've seen from previous years?
Well, it's changed in both positive and negative ways. So in a negative way, in terms of the general practice crisis, COVID has been a distraction, if you like, for policymakers. Every time a new wave of COVID comes along, it's almost impossible to have a conversation with policymakers about anything other than COVID. So, the vaccination program would be an example of that. PPE, testing, a whole range of different things that we talk about. So very difficult for them to get headspace to have conversations about the more deep and enduring crisis that we're experiencing in general practice. So that's been a problem. On the positive side, I don't know who it was who said, always make use of a crisis. We've managed to use the crisis as a way of getting some of our agenda, my pre-existing priorities when I became chair, which was about 2 months before the pandemic hit. We've used the pandemic in order to really push those agendas. So things like, one of the ways was to support general practices to to change the way that they work. And we've used the pandemic, particularly around the use of technology in that respect. Another of my priorities was supporting a stronger emphasis on continuity, what we call relationship-based care. Maybe I'll come back to that. But as healthcare has become more transactional because of the pressures that general practice is under, we've managed to use that as a vehicle for saying, okay, and this is what general practice is really about. It's about building relationships with trust so that we can be more effective clinicians. And then the final area that we've really pushed hard is what you might call the public health or population health model of general practice. So general practice traditionally has got three models. We look after diseases, that's a biomedical model. We look after people, that's the psychosocial model. And we look after populations, the public health model. And I think the public health model is probably the least developed in British general practice. And I think we've got a really important and indeed fundamental role to play in improving the health of the communities that we serve. So that's something else that we've pushed, and we've used the pandemic, the kind of focus on populations as an opportunity to push that agenda harder. So whilst it's been really difficult and there have been distractions, we've tried to use the crisis as an opportunity to really push our agenda.
Okay, so picking up on one of those, you mentioned about the relationship-based care or continuity of care, as many people probably recognise it. How do you see that changing over the next couple of years? Because obviously we're now hopefully moving out of COVID restrictions and into a place where, you know, things can be a bit more open and less transactional and stuff. How do you see that changing over the next year or so?
Yeah. Okay. So if I can just step back a little bit, from that question and just clarify the importance of relationship-based care, because the relationships, I think, to us as GPs are like a scalpel is to a surgeon or a scanning, an MRI scanner is to a radiologist. So they're the tool of our trade. They're what makes us effective. And in many ways, I think they're what differentiate us from disease-based specialists. So disease-based specialists are interested in diseases. We're interested in people, and we're interested in people, particularly the relationships that we form with people and the way that we use those relationships, those trusting relationships, in order to be more effective. So a simple example would be if I see somebody who's got a viral sore throat, if I know them and they trust me, I can generally deal with that in 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and then move on to the other 2 or 3 problems that they brought in their consultation. If it's somebody that I don't know and they don't trust me and they come in with the expectation that I'm going to give them antibiotics and they're going to argue with me until they get antibiotics, it becomes a 10-minute consultation about that sore throat. So at the most simple level, there's much more complex examples, but relationships are a really important and effective part of what we are. And the evidence underpinning them is really strong, actually. You know, we use so many interventions in general practice. If we understood how effective relationships were, we'd probably talk about them much more. So we know that if you've got continuity of care and an established trusting relationship, it's more likely that the patient will have a good experience and will rate that consultation positively. It's more likely that they will comply with the advice that you give them. It's more likely that they'll get better clinical outcomes, better management of their diabetes, better management of their hypertension, whatever. It's even more likely that they won't die young. Remarkably, there's a link between continuity of care and mortality rates, not just in general practice, actually across the whole system. So from a patient perspective, they're really strong. From a clinician perspective, for GPs, if you've got a relationship with patients, there's very good evidence that job satisfaction and professional commitment is stronger. And then finally, from a health service perspective, from an NHS perspective, if you've got trusting relationships, then patients are less likely to go to emergency departments, less likely to go into hospitals, and overall the cost effectiveness of care is much higher. So the evidence base is really strong for relationships. It is changing though, you're absolutely right. So coming back to your question, the nature of relationships are changing. The day that I was trained by an amazing GP, a grand old person of general practice really, Dennis Pereira Gray, who was a 5th generation GP in this same practice in Exeter. Excuse me, got cold. And his view of continuity of care was one GP, one patient for 40 years. That's the kind of practice that he worked in. I work in a practice in East London where we've got a turnover of 40% a year. I work 1 or 2 sessions a week. Patients have got a very different kind of concept of what relationships mean and their commitment to the practice. There's no way I can deliver, my trainer's model of general practice, and that's why we need to think differently about it. So if you can, I think the gold standard of relationship-based care is longitudinal continuity, knowing a patient over time. But actually, if we use our skills as highly trained GPs, our skills in understanding the human condition, the kind of psychology and the sociology of health and care, then actually we can build relationships really quickly. Even in one consultation, you can get a connection with a patient, which allows the patient to trust you, which allows you to be a more effective clinician. So the fact that society is changing means that we need to change the way that we think about continuity of care. We need to think about team-based continuity. We need to recognise that you don't have to be a full-time GP with your own list of patients in order to utilise the benefits of continuity. There are many different ways of doing it. And that's essentially why, as a college, we're calling this concept relationship-based care rather than calling it continuity of care, because I think there was something that was slightly marginalising about the concepts of continuity, where if you're a locum or were based in a locality for a short period of time or working very part-time, you almost were left with a feeling by the college that you weren't a proper GP. And that isn't the case at all. There's many different ways of using relationships.
Okay. Thank you for that. So I guess one of the other questions we often have, particularly from trainees, is the whole concept of training, and obviously the college is supportive and directive in terms of how training works for GPs and things. In terms of one of the common things that comes up is the length of general practice training. So I guess one question we have often is, when is it going to be increased? When will 4 years become the standard rather than the developing? And do you think it will increase it even further at any point in the future?
Yeah, okay. So setting the exam is a core role of our college, or indeed of all colleges. So one of the all medical royal colleges are charities, and their charitable function is to set standards. And one of those standards is entry standards into the profession. So setting that exam is really important. Training for the exam, it's a scandal, really, that we have had the shortest training for the most complex, deepest, widest body of knowledge of any clinician. It's crazy. Why have we got it? I guess it's for historical reasons. It isn't that long ago. It's within my working lifetime that training for general practice became compulsory. Specialist training for general practice became compulsory. And the only way that we could get a specialist curriculum up was to accept that the training was only for 3 years, recognizing that before that, or at least some years before that, you didn't need any training whatsoever. So 3 years was a great advance on nothing. But where we are now, if you compare 3 years for general practice with 6 or 7 years to be a paediatrician, 7 or 8 years to be a surgeon, it's clearly a crazy situation. We as a college have been lobbying for extended training, originally 5 years and then 4 years for many, many years. When Claire Gerarda was chair in 2012, we worked very hard on a case which basically got approval in principle, but didn't get passed. Other stuff was going on. There was a bill going on, and it was deemed to be too expensive to extend training. So we've been working on it for many years, but it isn't a top priority for us now. And let me explain why, given how important it is. The reason is there are other priorities. And if we were to go to either the department or NHS England or HEE now and say, we want more GPs, we need more GPs in order to be able to do our job, and we want extended training as well, they would say you can't have both. Okay. And at the moment, the priority has to be on numbers. And as a influencing organisation, a lobbying organisation, you're only effective if you have a really focused ask. So our priority ask at the moment is more GPs, but we will be returning to extended training. I'm sorry, I'm getting worse. Hold on a sec. But we will be returning to extended training. In the meantime, there's two things that we've got which are compromises. One of them is the fellowship scheme, so that you do 3 years training, you become a locum, or actually not locums, because locums are eligible for it. You become a salaried doctor or a partner, and then you have the opportunity to have a fellowship for a day a week, in which you extend your training in particular areas. It might be in practice management, it might be in leadership, it might be in the clinical area, it might be public health, whatever you want. So that fellowship scheme is one way of at least partially addressing the need for longer training. And the other area is that we have not quite completed yet, but we have made sure that at least 2 of the 3 years of training are in general practice, rather than 2 of the 3 years being in hospital base. So at least we're exposing trainees to the environment that they're going to be working in. So I think they're small compromises, but they are compromises. And I've got no doubt at all that in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, we'll be back to lobbying very hard for extended training. I think it's really important that trainees are behind that. And I'd be really keen to know whether the people on this webinar are committed to extended training, because when Claire was making the case in 2012, there were quite a few trainees who didn't want extended training. They liked the idea of quicker training and straight into practice and earning a better income, and being able to pay your mortgage and look after your kids and things. I'd be interested to know. I don't know where trainees are on that now. My impression from conversations is that most are in favour of extended training, but I don't know if all are.
Okay. Well, if anybody watching this wants to give their opinion, feel free to stick it in the chat. If you're watching this on the replay, feel free to stick it in the chat as well. Alternately, if you were to contact your local AIT network rep, I'm sure they'd be more than happy to share that information higher up into the college, as well as obviously more than welcome to contact myself, and I'm happy to share that with Martin from there. I guess sticking with training, there's a couple other questions that come up. And I guess one that always comes up is this concept of the examination, the RCA. And I know there's lots of questions around the exam and what they mean now and moving forward. But I guess from your perspective, where do you see the examination changing from what it is currently to what it might be? Acknowledging the fact that this is currently being looked at by the college anyway, and it may change in the near future.
Yeah, exactly. So I think people remember that there's 3 different parts to the exam, and the CSA was the original part, which we'd had for, I don't know, about 12 years, if I remember correctly, something like that. And the CSA was essentially...
I was one of the first people to sit it.
Oh, were you really? When was that then? 2007?
I was in the 2nd cohort, if I remember rightly, the December cohort. So
I don't want to age you, Gandhi. I don't want to age you. Okay.
Yeah, I can't quite remember which year it was.
It was too long ago to remember. Okay, but basically CSAs are standardised cases, and we had many years of experience, many years of evaluation of it, and we knew we had a really rigorous exam. Some people really liked it. Some people didn't like it. The problem was that when the pandemic struck, we couldn't deliver it. We couldn't bring everybody down to London. We couldn't use standardised cases. We couldn't bring people together because of the nature of the pandemic. So in a very short period of time, we had to design a replacement, which was the RCA. Where, of course, the work is done in practice and in a safer environment in your locality, rather than having to travel and come into a central location. And the RCA, given that it was designed in 2 months, and usually designing a new part of the exam would take 2 or 3 years, the RCA has been really successful. So the pass rate is around about the same. The differential attainment rate is around about the same. We had hoped that the differential attainment would be better as a consequence of doing kind of face-to-face normal practice, if you like. In fact, it ended up being around about the same as it was for the CSA. So it's a temporary measure that has proved pretty good, and the GMC like it. Inevitably, with something developed at short notice, it needs to be modified, and some modifications have been made to it just in the last year. So longer consultations, for example. So that's where we are at the moment. But we always knew that the RCA wasn't going to be the permanent replacement for CSA, that we needed to go back. We needed to collect data on the RCA. We needed to understand how it was performing, and we needed to rethink what is the best kind of form of assessment. And that process is ongoing right now. So I can't give any secrets away because people are at an early stage of development. But I think the options are maybe some kind of hybrid model of standardized CSA type cases and unstandardized real life RCA type cases, or possibly going back to a CSA model where cases are standardized, but modifying the CSA so that it more accurately reflects real life practice. So those are the kind of conversations that are going on at the moment. I'm not certain how it's going to play out. We've got a lot of good educationalists and a strong trainee voice, I must say. Our joint trainees are on the panel looking at the process. And our hope is that we will have a new exam in place probably early middle of next year, something like that. We were hoping it would be the end of this year, but more likely it'll be the early next year, I would have thought.
Okay, thank you for that. One of the criticisms sometimes labelled at training, and in particular over the past few years, has been very much that GP training makes you someone that can consult with patients, but doesn't necessarily prepare you for the full gamut of what general practice is, and in particular things like the business side of general practice, partnership. It's very much more focused on creating people that could possibly work as either locums or salaries, and less so at the other end of the spectrum. What are your thoughts on that, and how do you see that changing in the future?
Yeah, it's a really interesting challenge. I think the exam has to prepare GPs for the job that everybody is going to do, and not everybody wants to be a partner. There are a lot of doctors out there whose preference is to really focus on clinical work, and I think that's fundamentally important. So the idea of them spending a significant amount of their time in their training learning about how to become a business person is not something that would fill them with great attraction. And anyway, the clinical curriculum, which is the most important part of being a GP, is already pretty jam-packed. So that's the kind of rationale why we haven't tended to have done a lot of work around business. The other element, of course, is learning about how a practice runs, how it's funded, how to be a manager, a leader of people, how to assume responsibility for that business is often best done in the practice itself anyway, and often best done in an environment that you're actually working in. So that tends to be our approach, that you kind of learn on the job, you learn from your colleagues the business side. Now, the risks of that, number one, are if you don't expose people to being a partner, then fewer people might want to become a partner. And that clearly is a danger. When I first qualified, around about 85% of GPs were partners. Now it's about 51, 52%. So it's actually more than people think. There's still more chance of you becoming a partner than not being a partner, except that most younger, early generation GPs, early career GPs, want to become partners later than they used to. I became a partner as soon as I finished my training, offered a partnership practice I trained in, actually. So that was kind of great. Most people don't want to do that. They might want to spend 5 years doing locums or salaried posts and then decide whether they want the extra responsibility, but also the extra fun. There is some fun, and just in case you're wondering, of being a partner. The ability to control your environment, for example. So I think a lot of people want it later. So maybe a bit later is the time to be learning about it. And certainly the fellowships that I referred to earlier, the day a week offer that you can get once you've got your CCT, is an opportunity to learn about practice management and practice leadership.
Fair enough. I definitely agree with that concept of exposure may help to show people what the opportunities are. And thank you for answering that before I asked it as well. So it's like you've read my mind. I guess answering another question that often comes up, and in particular, obviously over the past couple of years, we've seen lots of different shows of what happens within the NHS, and one of the things that's often labelled general practice is not held in the same esteem as our colleagues in secondary care, and particularly consultants in secondary care, that we seem to be in some ways held by both our peers and by patients at a lower perspective, shall we say. How can you see that changing in the future, and how can we make it change more than anything?
Okay, so if you don't mind, I'm going to reject your question because I don't feel inferior in any way, or unless I kind of go on.
I'll clarify that. I don't think we're inferior, but absolutely agree with that. However, it is something that is often bandied around. And if you look at, particularly lots of forums, lots of perspectives that potentially patients also have with us within some of our consultations, that the opinion of a consultant is held in higher regard than their GP, in particular when it comes to certain aspects of management and that kind of stuff. I guess it's trying to tackle that perspective, both from the profession. So if we're including things like, the GP dump, for example, that there are examples where there is a different view of how general practice is compared to our colleagues who are consultants, which is effectively the same level. I guess that's more what I'm trying to get at, because I definitely agree we are not inferior.
Yeah, no, exactly. Okay, no, I understand that. So I think actually it comes back to us first. So we do have, and we must maintain and build pride in what we do as clinicians. And I've got no doubt at all that what I do as an expert medical generalist dealing with undifferentiated problems, having a broad set of knowledge, is a much more exciting career than if I'd become a cardiologist and I was sticking stents in people every day, or a surgeon, or whatever. So I think we've got a job that we can and should be extremely proud of. And what's fascinated me working as chair of the college and interacting much more with other specialties, I spend a lot of time meeting with presidents and members of other colleges, is how much they respect us for this as well. So the old days, when I was brought up in a London teaching hospital where if you can, you did, and if you couldn't, you became a GP. Those views just aren't expressed by the vast majority of colleagues, particularly leaders in the profession nowadays. And a growing number of our colleagues are saying, don't know how you do your job. It's just amazing. I wish I could be as clever as you are in doing the job. And also, most importantly, a growing number of consultants, all of whom are working under great pressure in an underfunded health service, are saying general practice must be the priority for new investment. So even they are saying, even the ones that are really struggling, oncologists, radiology, for example, are saying if general practice doesn't work, the rest of us can't do our job either. So I think there is a strong sense of, and a growing sense of commitment to general practice across the medical profession. Politicians, I think, are slightly different. Excuse me. Slightly different kettle of fish. It's quite difficult to persuade politicians that general practice has the same status as consultants. I think in some ways they're in the same place as the public, that there is something general about general practice. Everybody has a view on it. Everyone feels that they can express a view, a judgment about something that is general and closer to where they are. Whereas very few people will complain about a neurosurgeon or an oncologist. I'm frustrated. We're all frustrated at the moment, aren't we? That when a patient has to wait a week to see us, they complain like hell. When they have to wait 2 years to get their hip replaced by an orthopedic surgeon, they don't blame the orthopedic surgeon. I think that's just something we have to accept. Part of our strength and part of our existence is we are closer to the people. I think that's something we should be proud of.
Absolutely agree with that. I mean, general practice, in my view, is one of the few things in the entire country that will have contact with a patient throughout their entire point of their lives, and have contact with a person pretty much no matter where they are, what they do. It's one of the only few services that I can think of that has that impact, apart from electricity supply, maybe. Anyway, I guess I've had a couple of questions that have come through that are potentially a little bit more tricky to answer. And I guess one that I did want to share with yourself. So I'm going to read it verbatim, just so I don't get it wrong. So as an IMG, I feel the college doesn't support my needs. I do not see others like me in the college. How can the RCGP encourage more IMGs to think it's in their interests at heart?
Yeah, okay. So I understand that question. I think it's a very legitimate question. I think IMGs have not been well treated actually across the whole of the medical profession, not just in general practice. And I think we have an important responsibility as a college to address that. in part, that's making sure that our offer as a college, whether it be our CPD offer, whether it be our conferences and seminars, whether it be our policy influencing, our media influencing offers, are as relevant to IMGs as they are to every other doctor. That's really fundamentally important. And part, it's about recognising the specific needs of IMGs. And most recently, as a college, we've been lobbying around visas. We've been lobbying around family members joining IMG doctors, being able to join IMG doctors. So there's a range of specific things that we've been doing. What's very clear to me is that IMGs have always been fundamentally important to general practice. Around about a third of the GP workforce typically are trained overseas, and in many parts of the country that's increasing quite dramatically. In the latest round of GP recruitment, we have, as a college, lobbied very hard to increase the number of places. There's now 4,000 places. That's up 1,000 on just 3 years ago, which is a real victory for us. That's great. And of those 4,000, which there was competition about 2.5 people applying for every post. So at 100% fill rates in the training schemes, which was unheard of a few years ago. So that's really good. Around about, on average, about 40% of applicants for GP training are IMGs. And in some parts of the country, like my colleague Margaret Ikpo, who's a GP up in Hull, just become vice chair of the college, around about 68. Excuse me, about 68% of GPs on her training scheme are IMGs. So this is an issue that is very live and very with us. And we as a college are aware of it, and we're continuing to work very hard at it. So if you've got any suggestions for what we should be doing more of, or what we're not doing and need to be doing, please shout. Really important.
Thank you. And definitely sounds like there's some seeds of change happening with that. So happy to share that with the person that's posted that question and stuff.
Yeah.
Only got a few more questions left for you, and then happy to take any from the chat if we've got any at that point. I guess probably a good time to ask you the most popular question I got asked on numerous times. And it's basically, as a trainee, I'm thinking of leaving the RCGP when I finish my exams. How can you convince me to stay?
Okay, so I don't know what your background is. I don't know what gives you a buzz. So yeah. I won't answer the question for you, but let me answer the question for me. Why have I always been an active, or most of the time I've always been a member of the college, and most of the time I've been an active member of the college, either at a faculty level or more recently at a national level. And I think there's a range of reasons. The first and most simple and obvious one is, I think particularly the CPD products that the college produces are really high quality. So whatever I decide to focus on in my CPD and my annual appraisal, I'll always go to the college resources first. And I think the quality, the depth, the intellectual stimulation that you get from college products is really high. I do use other providers. I sometimes use Red Whale, for example, for my clinical CPD. I think it's really good. I think it's fun. I don't think it's that substantive, and that's fine. It's kind of their model. So CPD is really important. I think the conferences and webinars, RCGP Live, a range of other resources like that are often where I get a lot of my kind of not just updating, but kind of stimulation as well. The being able to hear from people who are leading in their field is a really important element of why I think the college is important. The next area is, as a GP, I care about general practice, and I want a body to represent my specialty and grow my specialty, and fight for my specialty. And that's my main job as chair of the college, and it's a really important function of the college. And I'm going to sound a bit preachy here, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound preachy, but it feels to me that if the college is doing a lot of work on behalf of general practice, then I feel I've got a kind of responsibility to contribute to that, even if it's quite a lot of money. And I know it is quite a lot of money for a GP earning over 50,000. and more than 2 years post CCT, the fees are about £540, something like that. So it's quite a lot of money. It's about 0.5% of an average salary GP, full-time salary GP's income. Less obviously if you're working under 50,000, and there's a significant reduction if in your first 2 years after qualifying as well. But it is a lot of money. I don't deny that, but I kind of feel that I have a responsibility to contribute that, given what the college does in lobbying around workforce, lobbying around bureaucracy, lobbying around training, lobbying around pretty much everything that we do. So I think that's an important reason as well. So I want to support my professional body that supports me and supports my specialty, and hopefully will take this specialty into a better place that I'll make use of it when I'm an old decrepit man. And then the kind of final area, which is, I say final, but I think it's actually the most important. The college for me has been probably my main professional network throughout my career. It's where I've interacted with fellow GPs and others who basically share my values, because they're the values of the college, but think completely differently from me. So for me, the college is what's given me a buzz. It's kept me energetic. I'm 60 now, been a GP, as I say, for over 30 years. I'm just as excited about general practice now as I was when I was a trainee. And the college has played a really important part in that. So it's kept up my professional kind of energy and passion and commitment, and I'm grateful to it for that. So those are the reasons that I have remained a member of the college, and why I hope that others will feel likewise. Currently, we've got 54,000 members. That includes international members and retired members, and people in training as well. We represent around about 70% of all doctors working in general practice, and about 60% of independent GPs working in general practice. So we have a pretty good reach, and it's improving. We still don't represent 100%, which is what our ambition must be.
You mentioned about being the voice of general practice, and you mentioned about reach and exposure and stuff. I guess one of the occasional criticisms of the college is it doesn't sometimes seem to be doing much when it comes to the media spin that happens towards general practice, and we've seen some fairly negative stuff, unfortunately, in the past couple of years as well. How would you answer the question that the college doesn't appear to be doing much when it comes to the media spin side of things? And again, how do you see that potentially changing in the future?
Yeah, so it's a common challenge that I hear, and it's probably one that I find the most frustrating challenge when I look at what we are actually doing, and what I think the question reflects is how difficult it is to get coverage for what you're doing, however much you do. So we've got a relatively small but a very experienced and very active media and public affairs team within the college, and our media coverage is the envy of every other Royal College. Even Royal Colleges that have got significantly larger teams. So we get coverage across all media, broadcast, written media, social media as well, which is far greater than most other colleges. We do use a whole range of media because that's what you've got to do. If you look at during the height of the criticisms of general practice, which was kind of between, I guess in particular, last spring and last early autumn, we had 10,000 references in various media outlets. And that included some big high-profile stuff as well. Just in the last week, I had a lead article in The Guardian about non-doctors working in primary care. I was on ITV News Tonight, which was about the crisis in general practice, alongside some other colleagues. Michael Mulholland, our honorary secretary, did a brilliant article on a day in the life of a GP in the Daily Mirror. We've had lots of social media interaction, particularly on Twitter, but on Facebook and other platforms as well. So my feeling is we're doing a lot. Can we ever? Is it possible to do enough? Never. How do you raise a profile of it? I'm not sure, but it's all of your responsibilities to do it. Every time you see a tweet, every time you get an opportunity to get on the media, to defend general practice, but actually more than to defend general practice. Our job is to defend general practice when unreasonable complaints are made about it, but our job is also to actively promote in a positive and constructive way general practice as well. And we're doing that as much as we possibly can. And as I say, we're pretty targeted in what we do. So I don't know how many people on this webinar listen to the Today programme. I think people of my generation, it's probably the principal source of news. What's more important is the principal source of news for policymakers and politicians. It's what they listen to all the time. And in the last 2 years, I've been on the Today programme 17 times, which is a record for any college and indeed for any chair of our college as well. So we're there. The media are turning to us. And you're successful with the media when they start repeating your messages back to you. And that's happening now, which is good. So I'd love to do more. I'd love to have a media team, which is 10 times the size that we've got. But I think we're doing a lot. And if you want to see how the college is defending general practice, we've got a protected web page on our website, which describes everything that we've done, all the media work that we've done and all the influencing that we've done. So take a look at it.
Yep,
and if
absolutely.
You still come back to me and say it's rubbish, I'll have a chat with you.
Fair enough. I must admit, both you and I know that we've discussed the media exposure of the college on numerous occasions, particularly whilst I was on the council as well. And I guess one thing I would always echo is always read the content as well. I know there's a propensity for people to read the headlines. I know there's always that saying, never read the comments, but actually always read the content is probably another way that I would say it, because I know that how easily the headlines can be taken one way and the content is actually showing something else. Speaking of content, social media has changed the world, let's be honest. And many people know that I love social media. How do you feel social media has changed general practice?
What an interesting question. I think I should probably be asking you that question, Gary, because I'm far less of a social media advocate than you are. So I use Twitter. I use it very sparingly, and I am much more likely to transmit than receive on Twitter. I did say to somebody that once I got 10,000 followers, I'd resign as chair, but I'm actually getting very close to 10,000 followers, so I'm not going to resign. I'm going to stay in post. But I think Twitter is really important, and I think all social media platforms are really important. Are we using them adequately as a college? Not yet. I think that's probably fair to say. Just one of our 4 media team has responsibility for our social media presence. He does an absolutely stunning job, but we're not there enough yet at the moment. And I think we need to build on your expertise and your experience and many other college members who are really into social media. So yeah, Gandhi, you answer your own question much better than I would.
So I guess for me, social media is a connecting tool. You mentioned about the network that was within the college and stuff. And actually, I've always seen it as a tool that allows people to connect across networks and past even networks and stuff. So, through social media, I've always had a way to contact people I wouldn't have had exposure to in other, realms and that kind of stuff. So I think that's probably where, sharing the experience and finding your own kind of tribe, the people that are similar to yourself, but may not even be in the same practice, is so powerful. It definitely has its negative issues. They can be echo chambers, they can be a source of frustration, and they can be addictive as well. You need to be cautious of that. But generally speaking, it's an amazing tool for sharing information, and ultimately information is always the most important thing when it comes to that. That's my really quick answer. I'm aware I could talk forever on that, and people are here to hear you talk, not me.
How many followers have you got?
Getting to about 6,500 on Twitter, about 8,500 on YouTube. So that's where I spend a bit more time and stuff, but getting there.
Good man, well done.
Thank you. So a couple of final questions. And you mentioned something earlier that I'm going to come back to, which will be my final one. We did have a rather challenging question. It's very topical given the time. So if people are listening to this is middle of January 2022. How much input did the RCGP have in the compulsory vaccination mandate, and any suggestions for trainees on what to do next if they feel that the COVID vaccination is not what they would choose? And I'm aware that's very topical because obviously in about 2 weeks' time, the mandate comes into effect in some ways if you've not had your first vaccination.
Yeah. Okay. So our position as a college, actively and passionately promoting vaccination, but against a mandatory vaccination for health professionals and for the general population. How hard did we push our position of being against mandatory vaccination? Quite hard with the CMO and with the UK Health Security Agency. Quite hard, probably not very hard, but we do generally feel that voluntary, particularly given the very high uptake amongst health professionals, particularly doctors, we do generally feel that that doing it voluntarily is the best way. And that mandation is unhealthy. I don't know how that's going to play out in the next couple of weeks. It's going to be interesting to see. I think policymakers have taken a very significant.
Sorry.
Apologies. I think policymakers have taken a very significant risk in the expectation that a lot of the people who are unhappy about being vaccinated will end up getting vaccinated before the deadline, on the basis that they've got mortgages to pay and families to keep. I hope that will be the case, that they'll do so without feeling too reluctant about it. But I think there will be a small group of people who absolutely don't want to be vaccinated, and it'll be interesting to see how practices respond to that. Obviously, of course, there is an option to do purely remote care in general practice, which you wouldn't have in many other clinical specialties, and that seems to me to be acceptable. Seems to be a good thing to do. But let's see how it plays out.
Okey-dokey. So obviously during your tenure as chair, you're now 2 and a bit years into it. Your tenure does come to an end this November, I believe.
That's right. Yep. Yeah.
So I guess it'd be useful, I think, to share with trainees, how is the chair elected and how can they have impact in the elections? Not to say that you need to go, absolutely do not feel that way. But I'm just aware that it is a change that's likely to start the process shortly, because what people may not be aware, the new chair is kind of elected at least 6 months before, if I remember right.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Okay. So it's an important question because the chair does have a very major role in moulding the college and ensuring that the college operates and delivers on our shared priorities. Just to clarify, our priorities, the things that we work on as a college, we generally have 3 or 4 in every 3-year chair cycle, and usually one of those is selected by the chair and the rest is selected by the membership. So there's a semi-democratic process that allows people to input into that, and then the chair's job is to make sure that those priorities are delivered on. So the chair is elected by council, not by the whole membership. So of our officers, we've got a president, which is a largely ceremonial role, the chair, which is the main executive role. We've got 2 vice chairs, 1 honorary treasurer and 1 honorary secretary. So the officer team as a whole is 6 people. The president is the only member of that officer team which is elected by the membership. All of the rest are elected by council. And council comprises about 65 odd people, of which about half of them are faculty representatives, and about a third of them are elected by the national membership. So they are elected by everyone who's a member. So the way to influence the process is through your faculty representative, or through a national representative. So that's the way that if you're not on council yourself, that's the best way to influence the process. The process starts after February council, which I think is the 18th of February, if I remember correctly. So an advert will go out, not only for chair, but for one of the vice chair roles as well. There's 2 of us where our 3-year term comes to an end in November. There'll then be a process in which people can apply, and I've spoken to a number of people who are interested, which is great. Really important that you get a good field. And the application need to be in, I think, by middle of April, something like that. And then they're vetted to make sure they satisfy the criteria for the post. And then at June Council, they have to give a hustings presentation. And at the end of that hustings presentation, there's an electronic vote over a 2 or 3 week period. And we'll know who my replacement will be probably by about the middle of July, something like that. And so there's then a few months process of kind of handover. Which I think is helpful for the new chair, just to get used to the role where they shadow me. So that's the process. So if you're on council, you can influence the process directly by voting for whoever you want. If you're not on council, then you influence it through your faculty or through your national representatives.
Mm-hmm. And what I would say is to any trainee who's interested in council, have an opportunity to look at it. Join as an observer. Get a chance to see what council is like. It's an amazing experience. I was proud to represent our members as a nationally elected rep for 3 years. It's definitely an opportunity, I would say, to take. But if you don't want to take that full step, join as an observer. Watch what council does, because it's really interesting how it functions, and to see the process in place.
And join your local faculties, of course, which you can do without being elected or without being invited as an observer. Faculties will always welcome people to contribute and to join their boards.
Thank you, Martin. We've taken up a lot of your time. We've not had any further questions. What I would like to say just before we finish, if you're interested in hearing more about the InnovAiT live streams and podcasts, feel free to subscribe, whichever platform you're either listening or watching us on. Also, leave us a like if you found this useful. Additionally, if you want to join the team, there is actually a current advert going out for being a clinical editor for the InnovAiT journal, which is an amazing position. And Martin talked about being a portfolio GP. Here's an opportunity to add another feather into your cap of being a portfolio GP. I'm pretty sure Martin's too busy to take that particular feather on as well, though. Really would like to thank you, Martin, for joining us. I know it's taking time out of your busy time to join us can be difficult, and I appreciate spending that time with us and answering some really interesting questions, which I'm definitely going to be sharing wide as far as I can to show people what the college is doing, what it's like to be the chair. And you never know, we might be having the future chair of the college watching this right now thinking, that can be me one day.
I hope so. Absolutely. Thank you so much, and good luck to everybody, and apologies for having frequent coughing fits in the last hour. Sorry about that.
No, not a problem. Thank you all. Wishing you all a great evening, and we'll catch you in the next live stream. See you later.